Today, we're going to talk about Reaganomics, and you will evaluate whether or not Reaganomics was good or bad for the United States based on some evidence. Before we get to the documents that have the evidence, let's talk about how Reaganomics happened. So, these pictures show long lines of cars lined up to get gas due to the gas shortage that happened in the 70s. But there's some more background we need even before that. Remember that the American economy grew dramatically from the end of World War II to the early 1970s in what was called the post war economic boom. The amount of goods and services produced in the United States increased enormously, and the prosperity of these decades raised the standard of living for most Americans. However, the economy began to falter in around 1973 to 1975 and created a pretty bad recession. In the years that followed, the American economy experienced a unique phenomenon called stagflation. So, you may remember that inflation is when there's an increase in the price of goods and services. And some inflation is good and reflects that the economy is healthy. But usually that's why inflation occurs. However, in the 1970s, there was a unique combination of factors that led to a stagnant economy but growing inflation. This dramatically affected American standard of living. People were paying more for goods each year, but their wages weren't keeping up with the prices. So Americans got increasingly worried about the economy, and economists disagreed about how to solve the problem. Because of this, the economy was a major issue in the election of 1980. The Republican candidate Ronald Reagan challenged the Democratic incumbent Jimmy Carter, who had been elected in 1976. Reagan was a conservative Republican who ran on a campaign of reducing the size of the federal government, lowering taxes, increasing defense spending, and supporting states' rights. He told voters that the best way to grow the economy was to cut taxes and reduce the size of the federal government. He wanted basically to shrink the federal government as much as possible. Reagan won the election in a landslide. He took office during a really tumultuous time. People were troubled by the economy, and the nation was deeply divided on cultural and social issues like abortion and affirmative action. For many conservative voters, Reagan's policies represented a promising alternative to the conflicts of the 1970s. His slogan when he ran for president was, "It's morning in America." Once in office, Reagan focused on cutting taxes, especially for corporations and for those earning the highest incomes. Reagan also cut government spending on social welfare programs while increasing spending on the military. In a couple of days, we'll talk about the Cold War and the Star Wars program that Reagan initiated as part of it. Reagan's economic policies became known as Reaganomics. They're also sometimes called supply side or trickle down economics. These economic policies tend to decrease the tax burden on the wealthy. And the idea is that the wealthy can then invest that money in the economy instead of paying it to the government in taxes. The term trickle down economics came about because conservatives believed that the investments made with the money would eventually trickle down to all Americans as the economy grew. Reagan would say, "A rising tide lifts all boats." It is not clear, still to this day, whether or not Reagan's economic policies were a success or a failure. They were controversial at the time, for sure, and whether or not they're effective is still hotly contested today. It is very clear when you look at what conservative policy preferences are today that Reaganomics continues to be a huge influence in the Republican Party. Political conservatives tend to argue that Reagan's policies were effective. Liberals claim they tend to only benefit a small number of wealthy Americans and hurt those with larger incomes. Sorry, lower incomes. The question that you're going to examine today is just this: was Reaganomics good for the United States or not? So you will look at several primary documents and then evaluate based on the evidence you find in those primary documents in a fully developed paragraph, whether or not you think Reaganomics was good or bad.